From icebound hunters to architects of empire, Europe's saga is written in blood and brilliance. When mammoths still roamed frozen plains, the first campfires flickered, sparks of civilization that would ignite cathedrals, revolutions, and industrial furnaces alike. This continent, carved by glaciers and ambition, transformed human experience through cycles of creation and catastrophe. Rome's marble gave way to Gothic stone. Enlightenment reason birthed romantic rebellion. Nationalism forged both unity and slaughter. Between plague and rebirth, faith and science, conquest and cooperation, one thread remains. Europe never ceased to reinvent itself, a civilization haunted by its past, yet forever gazing beyond horizons it once ruled. Before names, before memory, before the world thawed, Europe was a silence of wind and ice. Glaciers crept down from the north like sleeping beasts, their weight carving mountains and swallowing valleys. The sun rose, only to pale behind clouds of snow. The rivers lay frozen in their beds, and the forests had not yet returned. But even here, in the farthest margins of cold, life stirred. The first hunters followed the reindeer and the mammoth into the white void, carrying nothing but stone blades and endurance. They came from the east, Homo sapiens, wanderers of the great steppe, seeking what lay beyond the horizon. They were not the first to walk this land. For hundreds of thousands of years, another people had lived here. The Neanderthals, heavy-browed and broad of chest, masters of the cold, long before these strangers appeared. In dark valleys of Spain, in the caves of France and the Carpathians, their fires had burned without interruption, through ages that had seen empires of ice rise and vanish. For a brief span, the two kinds of human shared the same frozen stage. Their tracks mingled on the same plains. Their children may even have shared blood. Then, with the quiet finality of a glacier melting into sea, one kind disappeared. No war marked their end, only time. The Neanderthals left behind their tools, their hearths, and a shadow of their strength carried in the genes of those who replaced them. The newcomers endured because they imagined. They carved flint into shapes the mind had never seen, and on the walls of caves they painted the world they feared might forget them. By torchlight, they drew red bison and black horses, their bodies rippling in the flicker of flame. At Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira, art became the first defiance against extinction. These hunters recorded not just what they saw, but what they believed, that the hunt, the herd, and the spirit were one. In these caverns, humanity became aware of its own voice. When the ice began to retreat, the continent exhaled. Rivers broke their prisons and ran again. Tundra turned to meadow. The sea crept back into its old paths. Europe's face changed with every season. Where glaciers had crushed the land flat, forests now advanced, slow and relentless, pine and birch first, then oak, ash, and elm. Reindeer herds followed the melting line northward, and the hunters followed them, walking trails that would one day become the arteries of kingdoms. Their world was still one of movement and endurance. Families roamed from valley to valley, carrying flint, antler, and fire. They built shelters from hide and bone, shaped harpoons to fish the thawing rivers, and tamed the dog to share the chase. At Starcar in Britain's marshes, hunters wore antler headdresses, half human and half stag, dancing between worlds. In these rituals, one may glimpse the first religion of Europe, a faith in nature's endless return. By the end of the Ice Age, the hunters had become something else, settlers. The warmth drew them to rivers that fed and sheltered them. The Danube, the Dniester, the Rhine. They planted their camps where fish were plentiful and the soil rich from meltwater. From the Black Sea's shores and the highlands of Anatolia came a quiet invasion, more lasting than any war. The seeds of wheat and barley, the bleating of penned goats, the long patience of farming. The Neolithic dawned not with conquest, but with planting. People learned to stay. They cleared the forests with polished stone axes and burned stumps to ash, turning wilderness into field. Villages of clay and wattle appeared along the rivers, their smoke rising steadily through the seasons. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their homes so that ancestors might guard the living. The family, once defined by the hunt, was now defined by the hearth. At Lepensky Vir on the Danube, stone houses faced the river like shrines, each aligned to the sunrise. In the plains of Hungary and Moravia, long houses stretched 100 feet end to end, timber skeletons that sheltered clans and herds alike. And still, across this growing world, people remembered to adorn what they made. Pottery bore the marks of fingertips pressed in spirals. Necklaces of shells from the Aegean glimmered on bodies buried 1,000 miles inland. Trade had begun, carried not by armies, but by curiosity. As villages spread, so did ambition. Farmers who mastered the rhythm of earth and season gained power over those who had not. The graves of leaders grew richer. Copper ornaments from the Balkans, polished axes from alpine stone, pigments from distant coasts. The idea of prestige, like the idea of ownership, had been born. From it would come every palace, every crown, every war. By 5,000 years before the Common Era, Europe had entered an age of monuments. Across Ireland, Brittany, and the Atlantic coast of France, great stones were raised in patterns whose meanings are half lost but unmistakably human. At Karnak, they stand in ranks that march toward the horizon. At Newgrange and Gavrinis, they form tombs aligned to the solstice sunrise, where light enters only once a year to awaken the dead. In these stones, as in the cave paintings millennia earlier, the continent declared that memory itself was sacred. Farther east, copper gave way to bronze, a new alchemy of power. In the hills of the Balkans and the plains of Bohemia, miners learned to fuse copper with tin, producing metal strong enough to hold an edge through battle and harvest alike. The first smiths became the magicians of their age. From ore and fire, they drew not only tools, but prestige. Their forges were temples of transformation. Traders carried their goods along the old rivers, joining the Atlantic and the Aegean in networks that would shape Europe's destiny. Settlements grew into fortresses. The need to defend grain and metal led to ditches, palisades, and walls. Each village began to look outward with suspicion. In these centuries were born the instincts that would haunt Europe forever, to claim, to guard, to expand. Yet even amid this hardness, beauty endured. Bronze ornaments gleamed on the throats of women buried with care. Idols carved from bone and clay stood watch in homes. The plough turned the soil where mammoths had once walked. The continent, still young, began to show its character. The West became a land of ocean and stone, the north of forests and mist, the south of mountains and sun. Languages branched and blended like rivers, tongues that would one day become Greek and Celtic, Latin and Germanic, their roots deep in this first flowering of settlement. From these mingled voices grew the beginnings of culture, though no one yet called it that. By the 3rd millennium, BC, Europe was no longer a wilderness of hunters, but a mosaic of peoples, farmers of the Danube, seafarers of the Aegean, miners of the Carpathians, herders on the steppes. The ice had retreated, but its legacy remained in the endurance of those who survived it. The rhythm of the seasons, the reverence for earth and sky, the instinct to endure and build, these were the true gifts of the Ice Age to its heirs. At Stonehenge, the last and greatest of the megaliths, the stones aligned to the midsummer dawn, linking heaven and earth through geometry and will. To raise them required generations, an act of faith that outlasted memory. Beneath their lintels, farmers gathered to mark the turn of the year, to measure time itself. The circle they built was a calendar, a temple, and a mirror of the sky, an emblem of a continent that had finally learned to stand still. When the last glaciers melted from Scandinavia, the map of Europe took its familiar shape. The hunters' trails had become trade routes. Their fires had become villages. Their gods had become ancestors. The continent had found rhythm, but not yet peace. Beneath the calm of the new fields lay the same restlessness that had driven wanderers across the ice. In every generation, a few still looked north or east and wondered what waited beyond the horizon. That hunger would never leave them. It would send ships across seas and armies across mountains. It would build empires and topple them, carve cathedrals from stone, and send men to die for causes older than reason. But it began here, in the frozen silence broken by the first spark, in the dark caves where hands traced the outline of a bison's flank, in the patience of farmers who turned wilderness into home. Europe's story began not with kings or walls, but with survivors who learned to read the language of the earth. Out of ice, they shaped endurance. Out of endurance, imagination. Long before history began, they had already written its first lesson, that civilization is only the memory of those who refuse to yield to the cold. When the copper turned to bronze, Europe crossed a threshold it would never return from. In that alloy of fire and awe, the continent found both its voice and its ambition. Metal gleamed where once there had been only stone, and in its reflection the first kings saw their faces. Across river valleys and coastlines, scattered settlements bound by trade and myth began to imagine permanence. The age of wandering was over. The age of order had begun. From the islands of the Aegean, ships ventured across clear blue waters, carrying goods and stories. Crete rose as the heart of this new maritime world, its harbours filled with vessels whose sails swelled with the warm winds of the south. On that island, the Minoans built palaces instead of fortresses, wide halls painted with dolphins and lilies, stairways winding upward like memory itself. Theirs was a civilization that trusted the sea, that turned trade into ritual and commerce into art. In the frescoes of Knossos, figures dance unarmed before charging bulls, confident that rhythm could master force. To the north, on the mainland of Greece, a harder breed took shape. The Mycenaeans built walls as high as hills, their gates guarded by lions carved in stone. They inherited the Minoans' scripts and their taste for gold, but replaced their grace with gravity. The kings of Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos, ruled from citadels overlooking the Aegean, their power measured in bronze swords and stored grain. Their world was one of warriors and oaths, where glory outlived flesh and death was no barrier to remembrance. The trade routes that bound these southern realms reached far beyond their islands. From the mines of Cyprus came copper, from the hills of Cornwall, tin. Along the coasts of Iberia and through the mountain passes of the Alps, caravans moved under the watch of tribal chieftains whose authority rested on control of these gleaming veins of wealth. Across Europe, metal became language. Each sword, each axe, each ornament, a sign of status and skill. In the lowlands of the Danube, bronze workers smelted their craft into legend. At Unetis, near modern Prague, They forged blades so balanced that even centuries later their edges seem sharp enough to cut air. To the north, in the misted lands that would one day be Germany and Scandinavia, smiths raised burial mounds for their chieftains, filling them with weapons and gold to light their path into eternity. The bronze itself took on a sacred aura, a medium between earth and sky, life and death. Trade carried more than goods, it carried ideas. Along the amber routes of the Baltic, myths travelled with merchants, stories of gods who wielded thunder and sun discs that ruled the heavens. In the carvings of southern Scandinavia, boats, axes, spirals of light, one can see a pantheon taking shape, the first outlines of the deities who would one day be called Odin and Thor. The North was learning to speak in symbols older than writing, its faith written in light and storm. Across the Alps, in the fertile plains of the Po and the valleys of the Rhone, towns grew from trading posts into fortified settlements. The riverways became the first roads of empire, carrying bronze from the mountains to the sea. Farmers learned to terrace the hills, herders to drive flocks from valley to pasture with the turning seasons. The land was no longer wilderness, but inheritance, a pattern of ownership measured in walls, granaries, and graves. Yet bronze brought not only splendor, but fragility. The same trade that enriched kingdoms also chained them to one another. When one route faltered, all suffered. Drought, war, or a shift in the flow of tin could starve an entire civilization. In the 13th century BC, the world that had stretched from Mycenae to the Nile began to unravel. Earthquakes shattered cities. Invaders poured from unknown horizons. The seas filled with ships of exiles and conquerors alike. The collapse that followed was not a single event, but a long dimming. Palaces burned, trade waned, and the records of kings were lost to silence. The Minoans had vanished already. Now Mycenae's citadels joined them in ruin. In the ruins of Troy, a real city, not just a poet's dream, ashes buried the memory of the heroic age. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the world forgot how to write. But Europe did not end with its first fall. In the shadows, left by the wreck of palaces, new peoples stirred. In the forests beyond the Alps and along the Atlantic shores, societies that had never known empire continued to grow. They built with timber rather than stone, traded with neighbors rather than kingdoms, and forged their own myths beneath the northern stars. In the heartlands of Central Europe, cultures like the Tumulus and Hallstatt rose from the ashes of the Bronze Age, their graves filled with chariots and drinking horns. To the west, the ancestors of the Celts began to shape the patterns that would one day wind across their art. The endless knot, the spiral of rebirth. Their gods lived in rivers and groves, in mist and thunder. Their kings ruled as first among warriors, bound by oath rather than bureaucracy. Theirs was not the splendor of marble, but it endured longer. Meanwhile, the Aegean world learned to remember itself through legend. The stories of Achilles and Odysseus, sung by bards in smoky halls, kept alive the memory of a fallen age. The Greeks who would emerge centuries later found in these tales the blueprint for identity, a past that was already myth, a heritage both real and imagined. Their epics were Europe's first literature, the echo of forgotten kingdoms turned into eternal verse. While the South rebuilt through song, the North moved toward metal once again. In Scandinavia, bronze gave way slowly to iron, but the old rites persisted. Carvings on rocks near Tarnum and Bohuslän show long ships sailing under suns carved like wheels, the same image found in distant Ireland and Iberia. The continent shared a language of symbols before it shared a language of words. In Britain, where the stones of Stonehenge still caught the solstice light, farmers turned their tools to metal. Hill forts crowned the highlands, defended by ditches and ramparts, while trade carried goods between Ireland's copper mines and continental ports. These islands, once remote edges of the world, had become part of a continental rhythm, an orchestra of bronze that bound the Atlantic to the Aegean. As centuries passed, bronze's gleam began to fade. Its weakness was its beauty, too soft for a world growing harder, too precious for common hands. Iron, black and stubborn, waited in the earth, ready to take its place. When it came, it changed everything again. Tools grew stronger, plows cut deeper, and weapons multiplied. The societies that had once worshipped bronze adapted or disappeared. The old order, polished and ceremonial, gave way to something leaner and more restless. But before iron took its crown, the Bronze Age left one final gift: the idea of connection. Across Europe, from the storm-swept coasts of Ireland to the islands of Greece, people knew that they shared more than trade. They shared symbols, stories, and the unspoken knowledge that their world, vast and fragile, depended on the same veins of metal running beneath their feet. The collapse that ended their age did not erase that memory. It planted the seed of a belief that the continent was one body, bound by exchange, divided by distance, but united by desire. When the last bronze kings fell and their palaces turned to dust, the horizon seemed to close again. Yet in the silence that followed, something stirred. A new language, a new metal, a new age. Out of the ashes of the old world, the Iron Age was about to rise, carrying forward the echo of every hammer strike, every myth, every spark of fire that had ever dared to challenge the night. The Bronze Kings had fallen, but their memory lingered in the hills and harbours of the Aegean. In the ruins of their citadels, shepherds and traders began to rebuild, not palaces, but towns, small, self-contained, and fiercely proud. Where once the world had been ruled from thrones of gold, now men gathered in open squares to argue, decide, and dream. Out of that stubborn act of rebuilding, Greece was born. The new settlements were not bound by empire, but by belonging. Each had its own hill, its own river, its own gods. They called these communities Polis, city-states, miniature worlds that blended faith and politics, family and destiny. Athens, Corinth, Sparta, Thebes, names that would one day echo through centuries, began as little more than clusters of houses on defensible ground. Yet in their debates, in the rhythms of their festivals, they forged the foundations of Europe's idea of civilization. Trade awakened first. Greek sailors, steering by stars and coastlines, ventured across the Aegean and into distant seas. Their ships carried pottery, olive oil, and stories. They returned with timber, grain, and new ways of thinking. Colonies sprouted along the shores of Asia Minor, Sicily, and the Black Sea, scattering Greek speech like seeds on the wind. Each new outpost mirrored its mother city, but also changed her, sending back goods, ideas, and questions that stretched the boundaries of what a polis could be. Among these colonies, new alphabets took shape. The Greeks borrowed symbols from the Phoenicians and turned them into something enduring, a written language capable of preserving thought rather than merely trade. The first inscriptions are prayers, boundary stones, and dedications to the gods, simple yet revolutionary. A people who could write could remember, and from memory came the art of thinking. The memory of the old heroic age lingered in song. Rhapsodes, wandering poets, sang of Achilles' wrath, Odysseus' journey, and the fragile honor of kings. In those verses, listeners heard both the echo of their ancestors and a mirror of themselves. The Iliad and the Odyssey were not history, but they gave shape to the Greek imagination, a world where fate and free will wrestled endlessly, and where the measure of a man was his courage before the gods. Yet behind the beauty of words lay the hard logic of survival. Each polis was a fragment of a larger dream, but each dreamed alone. The land could support only so many mouths. Ambition required conquest. On the plains of Laconia, Sparta forged itself into a weapon, a city without walls, defended by its citizens' discipline. Every man was a soldier, every woman the mother of warriors. They were a nation of silence, obedience, and iron. Across the mountains, Athens moved in the opposite direction. Her citizens built ships instead of armies, traded instead of conquered, argued instead of obeyed. Out of that freedom grew something the world had never known: democracy. In Athens' agora, men of every station gathered to speak and be heard. The system was fragile and imperfect, resting on the exclusion of slaves and foreigners. But within its limits, it allowed an experiment that would outlive its makers. Laws replaced decrees, persuasion replaced fear. The city became a theater of ideas, where each citizen was both actor and audience. The Athenians called their government isonomia, equality under law, and believed it to be the highest form of order. The contrast between Sparta and Athens defined the Greek spirit: discipline against freedom, order against imagination. Yet both shared what made Greece unlike any civilization before it: a belief that human beings, not gods or kings, could shape their own destiny. When they built temples, it was to celebrate harmony, not submission. When they wrote tragedies, they examined the cost of choice. Their world was guided by reason, but haunted by the knowledge that reason could destroy as well as save. The philosophers who walked Athens' streets gave language to these anxieties. Thales measured the stars. Pythagoras found divinity in number. They sought not miracles, but causes, and in their search, Europe learned the habit of questioning. The gods did not disappear. They were everywhere, in marble and myth. But beside them rose something new: the conviction that the universe could be understood. The polis became a workshop of invention. Sculptors studied anatomy to carve marble that breathed. Architects measured proportion to build temples that seemed born from the landscape itself. The Parthenon would come later, but its spirit was already present in every column that reached toward the sky. A faith that beauty and order were one. Beyond Greece's mountains, another city was rising in a different tongue. On the banks of the Tiber, settlers from the Latin hills built huts that overlooked a shallow ford. They were farmers and shepherds, not poets or sailors, but they shared the same instinct for belonging. Their village, Rome, would grow by absorbing its neighbors, turning alliance into empire without yet knowing what empire meant. At first, Rome was little more than a fortified crossing, a refuge from the Etruscan kings who ruled the fertile north. Yet in its walls and forums, the Romans preserved an ideal that echoed the Greek polis: the rule of citizens over tyrants. When the last of their kings was overthrown, they swore that never again would one man hold absolute power. In place of monarchy, they built the res publica, the public thing, a system that bound ambition to law. The Romans admired Greek art and philosophy, but mistrusted its freedom. They valued duty, discipline, and the sanctity of the family above all else. In their households, the paterfamilias held power over life and death. In the state, the Senate claimed to speak with the same paternal authority. What Greece explored in spirit, Rome would enforce in structure. Trade linked the two worlds. Greek merchants filled Roman harbors, and Roman grain fed Greek islands. Colonies on both shores of the Adriatic bridged their cultures, blending Hellenic curiosity with Italic pragmatism. Slowly, inevitably, Greek ideas began to shape Roman ambition. The myths of Homer were retold in Latin. The gods of Olympus found new names in Roman temples. The Mediterranean was becoming a single sea of thought. But before Greece could give its wisdom to others, it had to fight for its survival. To the east, beyond the narrow waters of the Hellespont, rose an empire vast beyond imagination, the Persians. Their roads spanned continents. Their armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Where the Greeks fought for autonomy, the Persians demanded submission. It was not merely a clash of armies, but of worlds, freedom against empire, citizen against subject. When the Persian envoys came demanding earth and water, symbols of obedience, many Greek cities surrendered. Athens did not. She remembered Marathon, where her hoplites had once faced the invaders and driven them into the sea. She remembered the cost of independence and refused to yield it. The call went out across the islands and coasts, and for once the fractious cities of Greece stood together. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans held a mountain pass against an army so large it seemed endless. They died, but their defiance bought time. In the narrow straits of Salamis, Athenian ships rammed the Persian fleet and turned back the tide of conquest. The victories that followed were not just military, they were civilizational. The Polis had survived the empire. When the smoke cleared, Greece stood transformed. Her cities had discovered unity and defense, but her freedom came at a cost. The seeds of rivalry planted in alliance would soon sprout into conflict. Yet for a brief, blinding century, the world looked to Greece as to a rising sun. Philosophy, art, and politics flourished together, each feeding the others. Man had become the measure of all things, and Europe had found its beginning in that measure. The age of the Polis had taught the continent how to think, how to argue, how to choose. Soon it would teach her how to rule and how to fall. When the Persian threat faded, Greece seemed invincible. Her cities glittered like constellations over the Aegean, each burning with its own fire. Yet victory gave birth not to peace, but to pride. The same independence that had saved them from the east now turned one polis against another. Athens claimed leadership of the seas. Sparta demanded obedience on land. Allies became subjects. Treaties became weapons. Within a generation of triumph, Greece had turned her sword upon herself. The Peloponnesian War began as a quarrel of honor and ended as a wound that never healed. For 30 years, fleets burned, fields starved, and cities fell. The democracy of Athens, tested by fear and famine, devoured itself in suspicion and demagoguery. Sparta's victory proved hollow. Its discipline could conquer others, but not govern them. When the dust settled, the Greek world lay exhausted, its spirit drained by its own brilliance. Into that silence rode a northern wind. From the wild uplands of Macedon came Philip, a king who united warriors as quarrelsome as the Greeks themselves. His son, Alexander, inherited a weapon sharpened by discipline and ambition. At 20, he crossed the Hellespont with 30,000 men. By 30, he had conquered the world from Egypt to the Indus. Yet Alexander sought more than victory. He dreamed of fusion, a realm where Greek speech, Persian splendor, and Egyptian ritual could live as one. His empire died with him, but the idea survived. In its wake, cities rose like scattered embers of a single fire. Alexandria on the Nile, Antioch on the Orontes, Pergamon above the Aegean. In their libraries and marketplaces, Greek language became the passport of the civilized. Philosophers debated under colonnades, while merchants weighed silk and spices from India. The Hellenistic age was cosmopolitan before the word existed, a blending of East and West that made the Mediterranean a single sea of thought. While Greek culture spread outward, another power was gathering on the Italian peninsula. Rome, once a cluster of Latin farms, had turned its discipline into destiny. The lessons of Greece reached her through trade and imitation, but the Romans translated them into action. What the Greeks imagined, the Romans built. What the Greeks questioned, the Romans organized. The early republic learned government through struggle. Its citizens were soldiers, its soldiers landowners, bound by the belief that the state existed to protect their dignity. Patricians and plebeians argued in the forum, codifying their rights in the 12 tables, so that law might be stronger than lineage. Each crisis, war, rebellion, invasion, forced adaptation, until the Republic had become a machine that could absorb defeat and turn it into experience. Rome's first conquests were local, its ambitions modest, yet each victory demanded another. The Etruscans to the north fell. The Samnites to the south were subdued. By the 3rd century BC, Rome had united Italy and found herself facing a new horizon, the sea. Across that water lay Carthage, rich and mercantile, mistress of fleets. The struggle between them would decide who would inherit the world. The Punic Wars lasted a century, fought across continents and generations. When Hannibal led his elephants across the Alps, the Republic trembled but did not break. Rome learned to endure. Scipio answered with fire, carrying war to Africa and burning Carthage from the earth. From those ashes rose an empire of stone and law. The Mediterranean, once a field of rival cultures, became Mare Nostrum, our sea. Conquest changed everything. Wealth poured into the city, bringing luxury and corruption in equal measure. Victorious generals returned with armies loyal more to them than to the Senate. Reformers like the Gracchi tried to restore balance through land and law, but their deaths revealed how fragile the Republic had become. The virtues that had built it, discipline, restraint, shared duty, were being consumed by ambition. Civil war followed civil war. Marius against Sulla, Pompey against Caesar. The Republic, born in the hatred of kings, now bowed before a new kind of ruler, a dictator who ruled in the name of the people. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and with it, every limit Rome had set for itself. His death by senators' daggers restored the old symbols, but not the old order. Power had found its permanent home in the hands of one man. Under Augustus, the Republic became empire. The change was subtle, titles altered, offices renamed, but the result was absolute. Yet Augustus understood what tyranny could not, how to rule through peace. Roads stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Legions guarded frontiers carved into desert and mountain. Cities rose in marble where mud huts had been. Aqueducts carried water farther than any civilization had dared. The Pax Romana that followed was not gentle, but it was enduring. For 2 centuries, the world lived under Roman law and Roman time. The empire's genius lay not only in arms, but in absorption. Latin became the language of power, but the gods of Greece took new forms under Roman names. Mercury ran beside Hermes, Jupiter beside Zeus. Even the Greek philosophers found Roman disciples. Stoicism, with its creed of duty and reason, became the empire's moral armor. In it, senators and slaves alike could find a kind of freedom that no emperor could forbid. Still, empire carried the seed of its own decay. Expansion could not last forever. The frontier grew too long, the center too rich, the citizens too weary. As provinces prospered, loyalty shifted from Rome to local power. Foreign recruits filled the legions. Emperors rose and fell in barracks instead of forums. The Marble Age hardened into iron once more. Yet while the political structure faltered, something invisible spread beneath it, an idea that would outlast every monument. In obscure corners of the eastern provinces, new faiths whispered of salvation, equality, and peace. Among them, the teachings of a Galilean preacher began to move quietly through the empire's roads and ports. His message of humility and mercy found followers among slaves and merchants, women and soldiers, until it reached the very seat of Caesar. The crucifixion meant to erase him instead made him eternal. Within 3 centuries, the sign of the cross replaced the eagle on Rome's banners. Under Constantine, the empire baptized itself into a new age. Temples became churches. The calendar turned toward the birth of Christ. The gods of Olympus retreated into myth. Europe's soul had changed without its borders moving. But faith could not mend the fractures of power. Division between East and West deepened, wealth and learning flowing to Constantinople while Rome decayed. Barbarians pressed at the frontiers, Goths, Vandals, Franks, tribes drawn by the riches of the world's greatest city. Some came as enemies, others as mercenaries, all as heirs to what Rome could no longer defend. In 410, the unthinkable happened. The eternal city was sacked, its streets filled with smoke, its treasures scattered to the winds. The shock echoed far beyond Italy. For the first time, the center of the world seemed mortal. Rome would survive in name for another century, but its spirit had already shifted eastward into Byzantium's shining walls. When the last emperor of the West was deposed in 476, no trumpet sounded. The empire ended as it had begun, through endurance rather than ceremony. In its ruins lay everything Europe would inherit: its roads and laws, its architecture and ambition, its faith in order and its temptation toward empire. Greece had taught the continent how to think. Rome had taught it how to rule. And though the banners fell, the idea of Rome did not. Its memory became a mirror in which every future power would see itself. The dream of unity, the discipline of law, the burden of greatness. The ancient world had passed, but its shadow stretched across the centuries to come. Out of its fading light, a new dawn was already rising. The age of faith and the birth of medieval Europe. Smoke still drifted over the 7 hills when the emperors were gone. What had been a world united by law and language broke apart into fragments, each piece reflecting a different memory of Rome. Roads turned to weeds, aqueducts dried in the sun, marble crumbled into lime for new walls. Yet among the ruins, people endured. Farmers sowed in the shadow of broken temples, monks prayed in half-collapsed basilicas, and warlords carved kingdoms from the bones of an empire that no longer answered its own name. In Italy, the Ostrogoths inherited the shell of imperial power. Their king, Theodoric, ruled from Ravenna, beneath mosaics that glittered like frozen sunlight. He dressed as a Roman, issued decrees in Latin, and promised order to a people who no longer believed in it. But the empire's body could not be revived by imitation. When Theodoric died, his realm dissolved into quarrels and conquest, and the peninsula became a prize for whoever could claim Rome's ghost. Beyond the Alps, the Franks were learning how to turn victory into permanence. Their chieftain, Clovis, baptized himself and his warriors in the cold waters of the Marne, binding sword and faith in a single gesture. The act was political as much as spiritual. The church gained protectors, the Franks gained legitimacy. From that alliance of crown and altar emerged a pattern that would define Europe for centuries. A king's power might waver, but God's sanction did not. Farther west, in the hills of Spain, Visigothic nobles ruled a land they had taken from the Vandals and the fading Roman provinces. Their rule was brittle, divided by heresy and ambition, and would not last. Yet even in its instability, it mirrored a new truth. The world was no longer organized by empire, but by allegiance. Where once citizens had owed duty to Rome, now they served the man who could protect them. Across the sea, Byzantium stood like a mirror, showing what might have been. From his palace on the Bosporus, Emperor Justinian dreamed of restoring the old world's unity. His armies reconquered Italy and North Africa. His architects raised the Hagia Sophia, a dome vast enough to hold the heavens. In its shadow, he codified Roman law, distilling centuries of decrees into a single order. For a moment, it seemed the empire's heart still beat, but reconquest drained the treasury and hollowed the provinces it sought to save. When the plague came, it carried off more than half the empire's people, and the dream of restoration faded with their breath. In the West, survival depended on faith. As governors vanished and armies dispersed, bishops became judges, landlords, and diplomats. Churches inherited the stones of the Forum. Saints replaced senators as the keepers of order. Monasteries rose where cities had fallen, islands of stability in a sea of uncertainty. From their scriptoria, monks copied not only the Gospels, but the words of Cicero and Virgil, preserving a civilization they could no longer live in. The Dhaka humming of pens on parchment became the faint heartbeat of Europe's memory. These monastic outposts spread along the old Roman frontiers. On the windswept cliffs of Iona and Lindisfarne, Irish missionaries lit candles that would burn across the continent. Their abbots carried learning, as others carried swords, teaching reading, prayer, and the art of peace to peoples still half pagan, half forgotten. In their hands, Christianity ceased to be the religion of empire and became the faith of exile. But the wilderness had its own teachers. Along the Rhine and the Loire, hermits lived among trees and wolves, their solitude a protest against the noise of kingdoms. Their fame drew disciples, and their hermitages became the first monasteries of Gaul. From them grew networks of prayer and power that would one day knit together a continent. Meanwhile, the frontiers trembled with new movement. From the east came the Avars and Slavs, pressing into the plains of the Danube. From the north, the Saxons and Frisians raided coasts that Roman fleets no longer guarded. In Britain, the empire's withdrawal had left chaos. Towns decayed, Latin faded, and kingdoms rose like waves. Kent, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, each ruled by a warlord who claimed descent from gods rather than emperors. Christianity survived only in isolated monasteries, its Latin prayers echoing through halls built by pagan kings. Yet even in barbarism, memory persisted. The newcomers ploughed fields laid out by Roman surveyors, marched on Roman roads, minted coins with Latin inscriptions. They could destroy cities, but not the idea that order was possible. The empire's ghost whispered in every court that sought legitimacy, in every law written to mimic Justinian's codes. By the 6th century, Europe was no longer a single world, but a constellation of fragments. Each fragment carried a different inheritance of Rome: the law in Byzantium, the language in the church, the discipline in the armies of the Franks. Between them stretched forests and frontiers, where no authority held sway, only the slow rhythm of village life. The farmer replaced the citizen, the oath replaced the edict. Power became personal, measured in loyalty rather than territory. This was the birth of feudalism, not yet in name, but in practice. A lord granted protection, a vassal offered service. Both swore upon relics that neither would betray the other. It was a system born of fear and necessity, yet from its bonds of dependence grew the first outlines of stability. Europe had learned to survive without empire by turning hierarchy into habit. In this fragile balance, the Church found its greatest strength. Popes in Rome claimed to speak for all Christendom, even as Lombards threatened their walls. Their power rested not on armies, but on endurance. They crowned kings, sanctified treaties, and mediated disputes across borders that no longer existed on maps. Each monastery that rose in the wilderness was a declaration that civilization could begin again, even at the end of the world. Meanwhile, in the deserts far beyond Byzantium's reach, a new faith was taking shape. Traders from Arabia whispered of a prophet who preached the unity of God and the brotherhood of believers. Within a lifetime, his followers would conquer lands Justinian had bled to reclaim. The old boundaries between East and West were about to vanish, beneath a tide neither empire nor church could foresee. But in these years before that storm, Europe's future was being built quietly, in the hands of monks who copied books by candlelight, in the fields of peasants who ploughed beneath the gaze of their lords, in the hearts of converts who found in Christianity a meaning deeper than fear. The world after Rome was smaller, poorer, and rougher than the one it replaced. Yet within its hardships grew a new strength, the will to rebuild not as empire, but as community. By the mid-8th century, that strength had found a champion. In the lands of the Franks, a family of mayors turned kings ruled in the name of both sword and cross. Their heir, born of ambition and belief, would soon raise Europe from its long night. His name was Charles, and the age of Charlemagne was about to begin. When the 8th century reached its height, Europe still looked more like a memory than a continent. Kingdoms rose and fell with their rulers. Fields lay under constant threat, and knowledge clung to survival in the margins of illuminated texts. Yet amid that patchwork of faith and fear, a single vision began to bind the West together once more. It came not from Rome or Byzantium, but from the rough heartland of the Franks, where a dynasty of warriors had learned to rule in the name of God. Charles Martel had already halted the armies of Islam on the plains near Tours, a victory that turned the tide of history as decisively as Marathon or Salamis had done 1,000 years before. His son Pepin inherited a divided kingdom and reshaped it with diplomacy rather than conquest. In 751, with papal blessing, he set aside the last Merovingian king and placed the crown upon his own head, making the church not just witness to power, but its maker. The alliance of throne and altar was sealed. In return for protection, the Pope anointed Pepin as God's chosen ruler, a right once reserved for prophets and kings of Israel. Out of that compact came a new order, one that neither Roman law nor barbarian custom could have produced. The sword served the cross sanctified the sword. When Pepin's son, Charles, ascended the throne in 768, this alliance would grow into something vast. He was tall, restless, and relentless in faith and war alike. History would remember him as Carolus Magnus, Charlemagne. His reign began as a campaign and never truly ended. From the Atlantic to the Danube, his armies rode each year beneath the sign of the cross. Lombards in Italy, Saxons in Germany, Avars in the east, all fell before the weight of his discipline. But unlike the raiders and conquerors who had come before, Charlemagne conquered not only for land, but for salvation. He saw every war as a mission, every victory as proof of divine favor. In the forests of Saxony, Whole tribes were baptized at sword point. Rivers ran red before they ran holy. Harshness gave way, in time, to something more enduring: order. By the year 800, Charlemagne's rule stretched across nearly all of Western Europe. His empire had no marble palaces, no golden thrones, but it had a purpose as grand as any Caesar's. On Christmas Day of that year, as he knelt in prayer at the old Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his bowed head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The gesture united past and present, the ghost of empire clothed in the faith of the new age. To some, it was sacrilege; to others, salvation. Europe, long divided between memories of Rome and the hope of heaven, had found a bridge between them. From his court at Aachen, Charlemagne governed an empire by intellect as much as by sword. He summoned scholars from across Christendom: Alcuin from York, Paul the Deacon from Lombardy, Theodulf from Spain, to teach, translate, and record. Together, they built what later ages would call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival not of empire's luxury, but of its mind. In scriptoria, from Tours to Fulda, monks copied ancient texts in a clean new hand. Caroline minuscule, whose curves and clarity still echo in the letters of modern Europe. Education became a duty of faith. Bishops and abbots were ordered to found schools, so that even the sons of peasants might learn to read the scriptures. Charlemagne himself studied Latin and Greek by lamplight, though he never mastered the pen. His failure mattered less than his example. Knowledge had become a royal virtue. The empire's might now rested as much on books as on blades. Yet beneath this brilliance lay fragility. The emperor's realm was too vast to be ruled by one man, too scattered to be held by force alone. Charlemagne governed through bonds of loyalty, granting lands to vassals who swore oaths in his name. The arrangement brought order, but also risk. Every oath created a fragment of independence. When he died in 814, the balance he had maintained began to crumble. His son Louis, pious and indecisive, could not keep his brothers from turning inheritance into civil war. The empire split into rival kingdoms, each claiming the right to be Rome reborn. Even divided, the Carolingian legacy endured. The idea of a united Christendom, an empire under God rather than man, had taken root too deeply to die. The Pope in Rome, the kings of Francia and Germany, the emperors in the East, all would invoke it in their turn. The notion of Europe itself, of a shared destiny beyond tribe or language, was Charlemagne's truest creation. Beyond his heirs' quarrels, new storms gathered. From the north came long ships with prows, carved as dragons, their sails red in the dawn. The Vikings struck monasteries and markets alike, their raids burning through the fragile peace of the Frankish frontiers. From the east, Magyar horsemen swept through the plains. From the south, Saracen pirates sailed the Mediterranean, seizing slaves and gold. Every frontier was a wound reopened. Yet Europe did not collapse. It adapted. Kings fortified their towns. Local lords raised walls and militias. What had been the weakness of feudalism, its decentralization, became its strength. Castles sprouted like new mountains, their towers visible across miles of farmland. Power fractured, but survival spread. Each village, each manor, each monastery became a world unto itself, defended by its own oath and altar. The church, meanwhile, turned fragmentation into faith. Monastic reforms at Cluny rekindled the discipline that empire had softened. Prayer became labor, and labor became prayer. The monks' hours of work and chant ordered days that would otherwise have dissolved into chaos. Their lands produced grain and wine. Their scriptoria produced books and hope. They measured the rhythm of eternity against the noise of invasion. By the late 9th century, the old Carolingian order had shrunk into memory, but the habits it taught remained. Kings might rule only small realms, yet they still claimed descent from emperors. Bishops crowned them, chroniclers recorded them, and peasants ploughed their fields, believing that beyond their toil stretched a divine plan. The faith that had once crowned Charlemagne now ruled from every altar. Across the shattered map, culture persisted. In Ireland and Northumbria, monks illuminated manuscripts that turned parchment into heaven's mirror. In the courts of Burgundy and Saxony, bards sang of knights and saints, blending memory with myth. Even the invaders, once feared as destroyers, began to settle and be baptized. Norsemen became Normans. Magyars built churches on the plains they had burned. The violence of the age was forging not ruin, but transformation. By the year 1000, the fear that the world might end filled Europe's prayers. But the world did not end. The fields were fertile again, the invasions had slowed. The faith that once clung to survival now dreamed of conquest. Bells rang from stone towers instead of wooden steeples, calling not to despair but to ambition. In the forges and the monasteries alike, a new rhythm was gathering strength. The centuries of darkness had taught the continent endurance. The coming age would test what it could build. Kings dreamed once more of empire, popes of authority, knights of heaven won by war. The cross that had sanctified defense would soon call for attack. And when that call came, Europe, reborn, restless, and united in faith, would march eastward beneath banners embroidered with light. When the first millennium ended and the sky did not fall, Europe drew a long breath. Fear gave way to expectation. If God had allowed time to continue, perhaps he meant it as a gift to be used, not a warning to be feared. From that conviction rose a new age, an age of labor, faith, and daring, when humanity began to build upward again. Peace returned in fragments. Raids that had once scarred every coast faded into memory, and villages grew into towns whose market bells marked the rhythm of prosperity. Harvests swelled, forests receded before the plough, and rivers carried barges heavy with grain and salt. Instead of fortresses, towers of stone began to climb toward heaven. The bell tower replaced the watchtower. Sound became order, calling not to battle, but to prayer. From Burgundy came a spark that set Christendom alight. At Cluny, monks rebuilt monastic life into a harmony of devotion and magnificence. Their hours were measured by chant, their chapels filled with light, their altars heavy with gold and incense. Architecture became theology in stone, the upward curve of an arch, the disciplined geometry of a nave, the balance between light and shadow, all gestures toward eternity. Pilgrims followed that radiance from abbey to abbey, their footsteps tracing a network of faith across Europe. Other voices preferred restraint to splendor. The Cistercians, white-robed and silent, chose wilderness over wealth, raising monasteries where the forest met the field. They cleared land, drained swamps, and taught peasants the discipline of steady work. Each foundation became both sanctuary and school, its prayer inseparable from its labor. Between Cluny's grandeur and Citeau's austerity, the medieval world found its balance. Glory tempered by humility, contemplation wedded to toil. Urban life revived with equal force. Guilds of merchants and craftsmen filled new streets, while trade fairs turned crossroads into cities. Wool from Flanders, salt from the Rhineland, and wine from Burgundy changed hands under the watch of rising cathedrals. Builders, masons, and glassmakers transformed civic pride into art. At Chartres, light became language. the blue of the Virgin's mantle burning brighter than sapphire. At Santiago de Compostela, pilgrims carried scallop shells from distant shores, each a token of absolution and belonging. These great churches were more than houses of worship. They were stone visions of the world redeemed. Learning followed wealth. Cathedral schools in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford gathered students who came seeking the logic of faith. Aristotle's long-lost texts reappeared in Latin dress, and thinkers like Anselm and Abelard tried to reconcile revelation with reason. In lecture halls that echoed with disputation, knowledge became a form of prayer, an attempt to prove that understanding itself was divine. From those classrooms would emerge the first universities, institutions born not of conquest, but of curiosity. Beyond Europe's walls, the world beckoned. Caravans from the east brought silks, spices, and the shock of difference. Merchants returning from Constantinople spoke of domes that shimmered like planets, of scholars who read Aristotle in Arabic. Curiosity turned to longing, and longing to restlessness. Pilgrimage filled the roads again, this time with both devotion and discovery. Men and women walked to Rome, to Compostela, and finally to Jerusalem, convinced that distance could purify what prosperity had dulled. In 1095, a single sermon transformed that movement. Pope Urban II, preaching before a sea of knights and peasants, demanded that Christ's followers reclaim his tomb from unbelievers. God wills it, the crowd cried, and the first crusade was born. Peasants marched beside nobles, merchants beside monks, a continent united by the promise of redemption through arms. What began as pilgrimage became holy war. The journey east was an ordeal of endurance and faith, crossing mountains and deserts. The Crusaders fought hunger as fiercely as they fought men. When Jerusalem finally fell in 1099, hymns of triumph mingled with the screams of slaughter. For those who survived, the victory seemed divine proof that courage and belief could remake the world. For others, it was the beginning of a reckoning that faith alone could not justify. In Europe, news of success rekindled both devotion and ambition. Nobles pledged new crusades, merchants found profit in outfitting them, popes wielded the cross as weapon and banner alike. Yet the encounter between East and West did more than sanctify violence. It reopened the channels of exchange. From Arabic libraries came lost fragments of Plato and Galen. From Muslim physicians, the arts of healing and measurement. What armies took by force, scholars reclaimed through study. The same century that saw blood flow in Jerusalem also saw wisdom return to Paris. By 1150, the age of the Crusades had reshaped everything it touched. Stone and parchment, sword and scripture, all bore the mark of renewed confidence. Across the continent, people believed not merely in God's eternity, but in their own capacity to reflect it. Towns thrived, learning expanded, and cathedrals rose higher with every generation. The High Middle Ages stood at its zenith, bright and intricate as stained glass. An age certain of its purpose, unaware that certainty itself would soon be tested. By the middle of the 12th century, Europe no longer felt like a survivor of collapse. It had become a builder, a thinker, and a power that stretched from the Irish coast to the plains of Hungary. Its cathedrals reached heavenward. Its universities debated the nature of God and reason. Its kings and popes began to measure the continent, not by miles of land, but by the reach of their authority. The High Middle Ages had entered its maturity, a time of creation and conflict, when belief itself was the battlefield. From the banks of the Seine to the valleys of Lombardy, the pulse of commerce quickened. Markets swelled into towns, and towns into cities that glowed with ambition. Merchants financed cathedrals, bankers weighed coins stamped with the faces of kings, and cloth from Flanders competed with silks from the East. Wealth brought literacy, contracts, and charters. Behind parchment and seal lay a revolution of thought, the rediscovery that order could be written, not merely inherited. Power shifted with that discovery. Nobles who once ruled through lineage now found their authority constrained by law and by faith. Kings summoned assemblies, drafted edicts, and sent clerks into the countryside to record the wealth of their subjects. From this bureaucracy arose the first hints of national identity. France under the Capetians, England under the Plantagenets, Castile and Aragon rising from the Reconquista. Each kingdom spoke its own tongue, but shared the same grammar of rule, the fusion of sword and scripture, oath and document. Yet the center of gravity still belonged to the church. No monarch, however proud, could reign without papal blessing. The popes of the 12th century, inheritors of Gregory VII's reforming zeal, wielded moral authority like a blade. Their letters traveled faster than any army. Their words could unmake kings. Under Innocent III, the papacy reached the height of its influence, claiming to stand not only above princes, but above history itself. The world was God's kingdom, and the Pope his steward. That supremacy provoked its equal and opposite reaction. Emperors of the Holy Roman realm, Frederick Barbarossa first, then Frederick II, saw themselves as heirs to Caesar, bound to govern by divine right, not papal permission. Between Rome and the German court stretched an invisible frontier of ambition. The struggle for Italy became its symbol. Emperors marching south to assert imperial law, popes calling crusades against them in defense of spiritual independence. Neither side won, yet both shaped the balance that would define Europe, the uneasy marriage of church and state. While emperors and popes contested power, thinkers in Paris and Bologna fought quieter wars of meaning. Peter Abelard had already scandalized the pious by asking whether logic could serve faith. His successors went further. Thomas Aquinas sought harmony where others saw conflict, weaving Aristotle's reason into Christian doctrine, like gold thread into tapestry. In his Summa Theologica, he built a cathedral of words, immense, orderly, and luminous. It did not destroy mystery, but gave it structure, proving that intellect itself could be an act of worship. The universities that nurtured such minds became cities within cities. Students slept in attics, debated in taverns, and filled the streets with languages from every province. They argued about grace and geometry, politics and plague, copying manuscripts by candlelight until the scent of wax and ink filled entire quarters. What the monasteries had preserved, the schools expanded, turning preservation into creation. Knowledge had regained its confidence. The same century that exalted thought also renewed conquest. Across Iberia, Christian kings pushed south against the last strongholds of Al-Andalus. Their victories were not just territorial, but spiritual, a reconquest of Christendom's imagined boundaries. Knights who had once fought in Syria now took up arms in Spain, carrying with them the memory of Jerusalem's dust. New orders rose to serve both God and war: the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights. They built castles where monasteries might have stood, fortresses of faith overlooking deserts, seas, and frozen plains. Eastward, the crusading impulse turned toward conversion. The Baltic became Europe's final frontier. Pagan Prussians and Livonians faced missionaries with sword in one hand, cross in the other. Behind them followed settlers, merchants, and chroniclers who wrote of frozen seas and northern lights, as though they were glimpses of Eden. the expansion of Christendom was no longer measured only by pilgrimage, but by colonization, a transformation that would echo for centuries. Even as faith conquered outwardly, it fractured within. Heresy took root in the very soil that had nurtured orthodoxy. In the towns of Languedoc, the Cathars preached a purer Christianity, rejecting the material world as evil. Their dualism threatened both church and order, drawing followers from merchants weary of corruption and mystics seeking transcendence. The papacy's answer was ferocious. The Albigensian Crusade, a campaign that turned France's southern valleys into fields of fire. The sword of salvation spared no one, for to doubt was to endanger the soul of Europe itself. From those flames emerged new instruments of control. The Inquisition formalized investigation. Confession became not only sacrament, but surveillance. Faith that had built cathedrals now built systems of doctrine, of judgment, of record. Piety and fear moved hand in hand. Yet even in repression, there was invention. The confessional bound conscience to discipline, teaching every Christian that salvation required examination. Amid authority and orthodoxy, other voices sang of love instead of law. In Provence, troubadours composed verses for lords and ladies, shaping a vocabulary of emotion that would outlast dynasties. Their poetry of courtly love and chivalric honor softened the rough edges of feudal life. Knights began to measure valor not only by victory, but by courtesy. Women, once trophies of alliance, became muses of devotion. The culture of Europe had discovered intimacy alongside faith. Art mirrored this transformation. In the workshops of France and Flanders, sculptors carved saints with faces of compassion rather than majesty. Light poured through glass that told the story of salvation in color instead of Latin. Gothic architecture reached its perfection. At Reims, Amiens, and Paris, vaults soared so high they seemed to dissolve in air. Each cathedral was both sermon and statement, the visible argument that faith and intellect, beauty and precision could coexist. By 1300, the continent stood at a summit of prosperity and confidence. Fields yielded more than ever before, cities multiplied, languages matured into literature, Dante composing in Italian, Chrétien de Troyes in French, Wolfram von Eschenbach in German. The divine order seemed complete, a harmony of labor, hierarchy, and belief. Yet in that perfection, cracks were forming. Popes and kings quarreled over taxes. Peasants murmured against feudal dues. Scholars whispered doubts that reason could cage the infinite. Europe had raised a civilization as intricate as any it had known, woven from gold, glass, and faith. But every tower that touched the sky also cast a shadow, and that shadow was growing. The same confidence that had built cathedrals and crowned kings would soon face its reckoning. Beyond the horizon waited famine, pestilence, and war, the trials that would end one world and give birth to another. At the dawn of the 14th century, Europe looked unshakable. Cathedrals crowned its cities, commerce bound its kingdoms, and faith reached every hearth. But stability, like stone, can crack from within. The very structures that had made the continent flourish, its feudal hierarchies, its churchly power, its dense webs of trade, were about to become the channels through which disaster spread. The first warning came from the skies. Seasons turned uncertain, summers shorter, winters longer. Rains returned year after year, drowning harvests and rotting grain in the fields. Famine followed like a shadow. Between 1315 and 1322, hunger moved through the villages of France, England, and the Low Countries, claiming millions. Corpses lay in ditches, unburied. Mothers sold their children for bread. Chroniclers wrote that even the rich grew thin, for silver could not conjure wheat from mud. The age of abundance had ended. The countryside never fully recovered. Weakened peasants fled to the towns, where merchants' guilds and city councils wrestled to maintain order. Behind their gates, urban wealth gleamed brighter than ever, even as the fields that fed it lay neglected. Class lines hardened, resentment brewed. Europe had survived the weather, but not unchanged. When prosperity returned, it came with a fever. In 1347, ships from the Black Sea anchored at Messina, their crews already dying. Rats scurried down the gangplanks, fleas within their fur carrying an invisible terror. Within months, the plague reached Sicily, then Marseille, then the ports of Spain and England. It spread not by armies, but by commerce. The same routes that had carried spices and silk now bore death. No fortress could keep it out. The sick fell in the streets, and families sealed their doors against each other. In towns like Florence and London, carts rolled through the alleys at night, piled high with bodies. Priests died hearing confessions, physicians perished beside their patients, and even grave diggers could not keep pace. Chroniclers called it the Great Mortality. In some parishes, 9 of every 10 souls vanished. The faith that had once united Europe turned inward and wild. Flagellants roamed from city to city, whipping their backs bloody beneath the rain as atonement for humanity's sins. Others blamed the Jews, whose persecution spread faster than the plague itself. Burnings, expulsions, massacres that left a scar as deep as the pestilence. The church, bewildered and divided, could only pray. Its priests died as quickly as its sinners, and heaven remained silent. When the pestilence finally ebbed, it left behind an altered world. Villages lay abandoned, their fields reclaimed by forest. Labor became scarce. Wages rose. Serfs who once bowed to their lords now bargained like free men, and the old order began to tremble. Feudalism had survived centuries of war, but not this quiet rebellion of necessity. Out of death came mobility, social, economic, and eventually political. The survivors inherited not only land, but a sense of leverage. Power responded in kind. Monarchs, stripped of tax revenue and men, sought to consolidate what remained. Kings who had once ruled by ceremony now governed by calculation. France's Capetian line gave way to the Valois. England's Plantagenets tightened their grip on Parliament. The same conflicts that had once been feudal disputes now hardened into wars of nations. The longest of them began over a claim to a crown. In 1337, Edward III of England declared himself rightful King of France through his mother's blood. The 100 Years' War began as an inheritance quarrel, but grew into a contest of identity. At Crécy and Poitiers, English longbows shredded the pride of French chivalry. At Agincourt, mud and rain humbled knights in golden armor. Yet the war did more than kill men. It created nations. Each side began to imagine itself not as the property of a ruler, but as a people with a common destiny. Within that crucible of violence, figures arose who seemed carved from legend. In 1429, a peasant girl from Domremy rode to war, claiming that voices from heaven had called her to save France. Joan of Arc entered Orléans dressed in white armor, her banner of lilies brighter than any sword. She turned despair into purpose, rallying soldiers who had forgotten how to believe. Her capture and execution by the English made her martyr, and her victory immortal. After her death, the French crown was restored at Reims, and the tide of war turned. While kingdoms battled and plague returned in waves, another conflict spread within the church itself. In 1309, the papacy fled Rome for Avignon, its popes now subjects of French influence. Critics called them prisoners of luxury, their palaces filled with gold while Christendom starved. When a rival pope rose in Rome, the church split into obedience and opposition. Two popes excommunicated each other, and faith itself seemed fractured. The Great Schism lasted nearly 40 years, until the Council of Constance restored unity, but not trust. Authority, once unquestioned, had become negotiable. Artists and poets captured the world's unraveling in words and images of startling clarity. Dante's Divine Comedy guided souls through hell and heaven, as though the plague's death toll were a pilgrimage of its own. Petrarch looked backward to Rome, seeing in its ruins the promise of rebirth. Boccaccio, in his Decameron, turned tragedy into reflection, describing a world of youth and desire, surviving amid the tombs. Through their pens, medieval certainty gave way to self-awareness. Humanity had discovered its own perspective. As the 15th century opened, the outlines of modern Europe began to flicker through the haze of calamity. Commerce revived, but power flowed towards cities rather than castles. Venice, Florence, and Genoa commanded the seas, their merchants rivaling kings. Wealth bought learning, and learning bought influence. The Medici of Florence financed not crusades, but cathedrals of art. Patronage replaced pilgrimage as a path to salvation. In their workshops, artists studied anatomy and shadow, rediscovering the geometry that the ancients had known. Painters like Giotto and sculptors like Ghiberti turned devotion into realism. Halos gave way to human faces. Churches once built to humble man now glorified creation itself. The Renaissance had not yet been named, but its light was rising behind the plague's shadow. Change came not only through paint and marble, but through the hum of a new machine. In the 1440s, Johannes Gutenberg of Mainz fitted movable metal type into a wooden press and revolutionized thought. What monks had copied in months, printers could produce in days. The written word escaped the cloister and entered the marketplace. Books ceased to be treasures and became tools. For the first time since the fall of Rome, knowledge outran the gatekeepers who guarded it. By 1453, one world had ended and another was beginning. In the east, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, its walls breached by cannon fire, the last echo of the Roman Empire swallowed by the new. Scholars fleeing the city carried with them manuscripts and memory, planting the seeds of classical learning in Italy's soil. To the west, the kingdoms of England and France emerged exhausted but defined, their banners hardened by a century of war. Europe stood at the threshold of its own rediscovery, poorer, wiser, and infinitely more restless. The Middle Ages had begun in fear of the world's end. They closed with the discovery that creation could begin again. Plague had purified. War had reshaped. Doubt had awakened the mind. Out of ruin came renewal, the conviction that humanity itself, no longer just a reflection of God, might become his instrument. The age of princes and painters was dawning, and with it, the modern world. When Constantinople fell, the last shimmer of Rome's empire vanished beneath Ottoman banners. Yet what seemed an ending became the start of something larger. Scholars fled westward with their manuscripts and memories, carrying the wisdom of Greece into a continent ready to listen again. Their arrival in Italy turned loss into inheritance. The ancient world, long buried under medieval dust, began to breathe. In Florence, that breath became creation. The city had neither an empire nor an army, but it possessed wealth, confidence, and imagination. The Medici family, bankers with the souls of princes, poured gold into stone and pigment, hiring artists to remake the divine in human form. Brunelleschi raised domes that defied geometry. Donatello carved prophets who looked like living men. Botticelli's Venus stepped from the sea with the calm of revelation. Art ceased to serve fear and began to celebrate wonder. The revival spread outward like dawn, creeping across valleys. In Venice, painters learned how to trap light in oil and air. In Milan, Leonardo filled his notebooks with inventions that blurred the boundary between science and dream. Rome, once humbled, rose again as popes turned patrons. Raphael painted serenity into flesh. Michelangelo chiseled defiance from marble, his David standing like man himself, naked before the world, fearless before God. Humanism gave this age its mind. Scholars returned to the languages of antiquity, searching not only for texts, but for tone. They discovered that wisdom could be human and sacred at once. Petrarch and Erasmus praised reason as a mirror of creation. Pico della Mirandola declared that man was free to shape himself, the shaper of his own nature. The world had not abandoned heaven. It had learned to see it reflected in the mirror of mankind. But where beauty gathered, corruption followed. The papal court glimmered with gold bought by indulgence, and priests sold forgiveness like merchandise. Faith that had once united the West grew heavy with its own splendor. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his arguments to a church door in Wittenberg and cracked the foundation of that unity. His words spread faster than any army. Gutenberg's press turned outrage into contagion. Within months, the theses that condemned indulgences had multiplied in every city, printed by men who sensed profit in controversy and conviction alike. Luther's rebellion spoke to those who felt betrayed by the church's pomp and to princes who envied its power. He preached that salvation came by faith, not ritual, that Scripture, not Rome, held the voice of God. For the first time since the Apostles, Christendom was speaking in more than one voice. Germany fractured, and with it, the medieval idea of universal order. Peasants took Luther's defiance as license for revolt. Nobles turned theology into politics. Wars of religion followed, fought in the name of conscience, waged for the sake of land. In Switzerland, Zwingli and Calvin forged sterner visions of reform. In England, Henry the Eighth severed his kingdom from Rome, for reasons less sacred but no less decisive. The Reformation had no single leader because it had become a principle that truth could not be dictated. Rome answered not with retreat, but with transformation. At the Council of Trent, bishops and scholars gathered to cleanse the church without breaking it. The Jesuits rose from that reform, a new order of soldiers and teachers, armed with logic, language, and loyalty. They founded schools from Seville to Krakow, instructing a generation that would fight heresy with eloquence instead of sword. Faith rediscovered discipline, and art rediscovered grandeur. The Counter-Reformation poured its conviction into splendor. Caravaggio filled darkness with revelation. Bernini turned marble into motion. Cathedrals became theaters of redemption, their altars blazing with gold and shadow. What the Protestants purified, Rome dramatized. Europe's churches, once uniform, now spoke in competing dialects of beauty. The severe lines of Geneva against the radiant vaults of Rome. Beyond Europe, new worlds beckoned. Portuguese caravels rounded Africa, their sails bright against horizons no map contained. Spanish galleons crossed the Atlantic and returned with holds full of silver and silence. Columbus had died believing he had reached Asia. His voyage instead had opened the continents. The discoveries changed not only geography, but imagination. The earth, once bounded by theology, became infinite. empires followed faith across oceans, carrying both the cross and the cannon. Exploration enriched the few and transformed the many. Gold financed cathedrals and wars alike. Sugar and slaves crossed the seas in chains of profit. For every triumph of knowledge came a new burden of guilt. The Renaissance, once the celebration of humanity, now saw its reflection in conquest. In its self-assurance lay the roots of modern arrogance, the conviction that creation itself could be mastered. While empires expanded, minds turned inward again. Copernicus quietly placed the sun where scripture had placed the earth. Vesalius mapped the body with the precision once reserved for souls. Artists studied anatomy, philosophers measured motion, and mathematicians traced order through the heavens. The same hunger that had built Florence's domes now sought the laws of the universe. The Renaissance was transforming from a rebirth of art into a revolution of thought. But beneath all this, brilliance ran division. Faith splintered into factions. Nations bled in the name of belief. France burned in religious wars. The Netherlands fought Spain for freedom of creed. England veered between papacy and reform until compromise became survival. The same printing presses that spread knowledge now multiplied dissent. Words became weapons sharper than any sword. Amid turmoil, the human voice grew stronger. Shakespeare's stage filled with kings and beggars, laughter and tragedy, mirrors of a humanity newly aware of itself. Cervantes sent his weary knight against the windmills of illusion. Montaigne turned the act of thinking into literature. Europe had found its reflection, and it was complex, imperfect, alive. By the end of the 16th century, the continent glowed with both light and fracture. Faith no longer spoke in one language. Knowledge no longer bowed to authority. The age that began with harmony ended in tension, between conscience and obedience, discovery and domination. The Middle Ages had built a world of order. The Renaissance had taught it to question. Yet the answers it found would not bring peace, only power. Out of beauty had come defiance. Out of faith, division. Out of curiosity, empire. The rebirth of the mind was complete, but the soul of Europe remained unsettled. As the new century approached, the same forces that had lifted the continent from darkness were drawing it toward fire. Beyond the horizon waited the thunder of cannon and the arguments of philosophers, the clash of nations and the birth of science. The Renaissance had awakened Europe. Now it would have to learn how to live awake. Dawn returned to Europe colder than before. The glow of the Renaissance had hardened into precision, and knowledge itself had become a weapon. Monarchs who once courted philosophers now summoned them to justify conquest. Invention turned toward machinery, and faith retreated behind fortresses of order. The continent that had painted angels in the 15th century now forged cannon in the 17th. Smoke first rose over Bohemia, curling from the towers of Prague like a dark premonition. A quarrel over faith ignited a generation of war. Protestant and Catholic princes, each claiming God's favor, gathered mercenaries who cared only for pay. Cities burned for doctrines few soldiers understood. Harvests withered under the tramp of armies. Mothers dug graves where fields should have stood. For 30 years, Europe bled itself dry in the name of salvation until salvation itself seemed irrelevant. When peace finally came, it arrived not as triumph, but exhaustion. The treaties signed at Westphalia in 1648 ended the notion of a single Christian order. No emperor would ever again speak for all, and no pope would ever rule more than hearts. Each state, great or small, became sovereign within its borders, a fragile arrangement born of necessity. Unity gave way to rivalry, and rivalry gave birth to the modern world. Out of the ruins, France rose tallest. Its monarchs learned that fear could be more reliable than faith, and Louis XIV turned that lesson into spectacle. Versailles shimmered like a second sun, every mirrored hall reflecting the image of a man who believed himself ordained to rule the earth. Nobles who had once drawn swords against the crown now drew curtains around the royal bedchamber, attending their king as if he were a living sacrament. Absolutism was not merely politics, it was theatre, performed daily beneath chandeliers. Across the Channel, England followed a different script. The Stuart kings spoke of divine right, but Parliament remembered older rights written in law. Civil war reduced the island to a battlefield of conviction. One monarch lost his head to his own subjects, another fled into exile. And when the blood dried, a new balance emerged. Authority had been tested and chained. From the wreckage of crowns grew the principle that would one day shape democracies. The ruler governs by consent, not by miracle. Meanwhile, discovery no longer ended at the horizon. Ships from Lisbon, London, and Amsterdam circled the globe, carrying guns, fabrics, and the fever of profit. What missionaries had once offered as salvation, merchants now sold as trade. Gold from America, spices from Asia, and slaves from Africa flowed into European ports, binding continents in a commerce that enriched a few and enslaved multitudes. Expansion became both glory and guilt, the birth of empire as Europe's second faith. Amid this turmoil, reason found its new cathedral in the human mind. Astronomers measured the heavens with instruments of brass and glass. Mathematicians uncovered laws that seemed to mirror God's logic. Galileo watched planets circle the sun, defying scripture with evidence. Newton reduced the cosmos to motion and gravity, proving that the universe obeyed rules rather than whims. For the first time, humanity glimpsed a world that might function without divine intervention. Philosophers gathered in salons and coffee houses to test that revelation against politics. In Paris, Voltaire mocked tyranny with laughter sharper than steel. Montesquieu studied government as a system of balances rather than bloodlines. Rousseau imagined liberty as man's natural inheritance, stolen by civilization. Their words traveled farther than armies. From Edinburgh to Vienna, readers argued that reason could build what religion had failed to hold together. The Enlightenment was not rebellion, it was redefinition. Art followed the same geometry of thought. Painters abandoned heavenly ecstasy for clarity and form. Composers turned mathematics into music. Bach's fugues sounded like architecture in motion, while Handel's choruses filled cathedrals with disciplined joy. Beauty became symmetry, faith translated into order. Even devotion seemed rational now, measured by rhythm and proportion. But reason could not quiet hunger. The wars had ended, yet inequality deepened. Peasants still bent beneath taxes, while nobles danced at court. Intellectuals praised liberty as kings censored their books. Progress glittered in cities while famine haunted the countryside. The Enlightenment promised harmony, but its light revealed the cracks beneath the marble. Ideas had become dangerous again. Across the Atlantic, 13 colonies tested those ideas in practice. They spoke of rights not granted by monarchs, but born of nature itself. When they declared independence, Europe watched with fascination and unease. The philosophers' theories had taken form in rebellion. Pamphlets, not armies, had begun to redraw the map of legitimacy. By 1789, Versailles still shone, but the air around it was thick with rumor and debt. Bread grew scarce, pamphlets multiplied. The people of Paris whispered that sovereignty might belong to them after all. The same century that had crowned reason as king was about to see reason ignite revolution. Thought had created power. Now power would demand transformation. Summer heat hung over Paris when the crowd gathered outside the Bastille. The old fortress, half prison, half symbol, stood empty of power, yet heavy with memory. On July 14th, 1789, it fell not for what it held, but for what it represented, the idea that tyranny could still cast a shadow. The stones that once confined prisoners became trophies, carried through the streets, and the air filled with a sound Europe had not heard for centuries. The roar of citizens who believed themselves sovereign. The revolution began as argument and ended as apocalypse. France, once the model of absolutism, became the laboratory of liberty. In the assembly, lawyers and pamphleteers declared that all men were born equal. In the streets, hunger and fear demanded proof. The monarchy toppled beneath the weight of its own excess, and Louis XVI met the guillotine with a dignity his reign had rarely shown. Crowds cheered, believing justice achieved. Before long, they were cheering again for the heads of those who had led them there. The goddess Reason replaced the saints in their chapels, and freedom turned inward upon itself. From that chaos, a new order rose on horseback. Napoleon Bonaparte promised stability after revolution, glory after shame. His armies carried not only muskets, but ideals, merit, law, and the rights of man. Across Europe, they tore down thrones, rewrote borders, and awakened peoples who had forgotten they were nations. Yet the empire that claimed to spread liberty did so by conquest, and in its triumphs, it sowed the seeds of its own undoing. From Moscow's burning to Waterloo's mud, the dream of a universal order returned to ruin. Still, it left behind more than wreckage: the Napoleonic Code, the equality of citizens before the law, and the belief that history could be remade by will. When the guns fell silent, kings returned to their capitals like ghosts reclaiming abandoned palaces. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 redrew the map with cautious hands, restoring monarchies and erasing revolutions. Diplomats spoke of balance, legitimacy, and peace. In truth, they feared contagion. But beneath the surface of their agreements, the ideas of 1789 continued to breathe. Liberty had become a language that could not be forgotten. The restored order lasted only as long as memory allowed. Industrial chimneys rose where cathedrals once dominated skylines. Machines replaced muscle, and cities swelled like living furnaces. Steam turned time into motion and wealth into division. A new class of workers filled the factories, their lives measured in hours and soot. The old feudal world had died on the scaffold, but inequality had found a new disguise in profit. Europe, reborn through reason, now faced the question of justice. Poets and philosophers gave that question voice. In England, Blake and Wordsworth mourned the beauty devoured by industry. In Germany, Hegel saw history as a dialectic, progress born of contradiction. Across the continent, reformers demanded rights for labourers and education for the poor. The revolution that had begun in the name of man's liberty now turned toward his dignity. Politics became philosophy in action, and the streets became classrooms for the disillusioned. Nationalism soon joined the chorus. The same armies that Napoleon had unleashed had carried more than flags. They had carried contagion, the idea that people who spoke the same tongue and shared the same soil might form nations rather than empires. In Greece, rebels fought to free their land from Ottoman rule. In Latin America, Bolívar and San Martín cast off Spain's fading grip. Every victory fed another. By mid-century, Europe was an orchestra of uprisings, each variation on the same theme, the right to self-determination. In 1848, that music reached a crescendo. From Paris to Vienna, from Berlin to Budapest, crowds filled the squares demanding constitutions, parliaments, and bread. For a season, it seemed that monarchy itself might vanish, swept away by banners of red and tricolour. But idealism burns faster than power. Within a year, the revolutions had failed, crushed by armies, divided by ideology, betrayed by exhaustion. The dream of freedom retreated again into exile, but it did not die. It hardened. The following decades turned faith in revolution into faith in progress. Steamships linked continents. Railways stitched nations together. Telegraph wires carried thought at the speed of lightning. Science, once the servant of kings, now served the public imagination. Darwin's theory of evolution redrew humanity's place in creation. Pasteur's discoveries promised mastery over disease. The world that had once bowed before mystery now sought to explain it. Knowledge became its own empire, measured not in miles, but in minds. Yet progress demanded power, and power demanded unity. Italy, long a mosaic of duchies, found its architect in Garibaldi's sword and Cavour's diplomacy. The peninsula that had given Europe its art and faith now gave it a nation. Germany followed, united under Prussia's iron hand. Bismarck forged unity not through poetry or philosophy, but through calculation, declaring that destiny would be written in blood and iron. In 1871, as cannons thundered at Paris once more, the German Empire was proclaimed at Versailles, the very palace where absolutism had once declared itself divine. That moment marked both culmination and forewarning. Europe had remade itself through revolution and science, through war and will. Yet it stood again at the edge of arrogance. The ideals of liberty and reason had survived, but they were now claimed by states that spoke of progress while arming for supremacy. The continent had become what it once rebelled against, an empire of its own making, rational, restless, and ready to rule the world. Behind the smokestacks and parliaments, the poets still whispered of the cost. Shelley called the revolution a glorious phantom haunting its creators. Marx and Engels turned its promise into prophecy, warning that history's final struggle had not yet begun. Every machine's hum, every march of industry carried the echo of the guillotine. The modern age was proud of its light, but its light was the color of fire. By the late 19th century, Europe looked outward once more. Steam and steel had conquered distance. Railways reached Asia. Telegraphs crossed oceans. The same powers that had fought for liberty now sought dominion abroad. Africa and the East became prizes in a competition disguised as civilization. The revolution's cry of equality had circled the globe and returned as empire. The age of kings had ended, but the age of conquest had only changed its uniform. From the fall of the Bastille to the coronation of the Kaiser, a century of upheaval had remade the continent. Thrones had fallen, nations risen, and thought itself had learned rebellion. Europe stood victorious over its own past, yet uneasy beneath its triumph. The fire that had burned away the old world still smouldered beneath the new, waiting for a single spark to set it alight again. When the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors, the applause echoed farther than the walls of Versailles. It marked not just the triumph of a new power, but the beginning of a new order, one forged by industry, nationalism, and pride. For the first time since Rome, the continent was united not by faith or empire, but by competition itself. Steam, steel, and science had become its gods. Europe stood at the summit of its own making. certain that reason and progress had tamed history. Cities swelled beneath clouds of coal. Railways threaded nations together, and factories turned daylight into perpetual motion. Paris and Berlin, Vienna and London, each glowed with the confidence of a century that believed itself permanent. In their academies, physicists measured the unseen. In their parliaments, politicians spoke of peace, guaranteed by prosperity. The bourgeois age had built its own cathedral, civilization convinced that invention could abolish tragedy. But beneath the surface, old ambitions stirred. The same science that had cured disease also built weapons no army had yet dared to use. Colonial empires carved the world into territories of resource and resentment. Britain ruled seas wider than imagination. France spread its flag from Senegal to Indochina. Germany, late to the game, demanded its share. Each nation measured greatness not by wisdom, but by map. The competition that had fueled progress now turned poisonous, pride dressed in uniforms. Europe's rivalries multiplied as alliances hardened. The peace that statesmen called balance was balance only in name, an equilibrium of fear. In cafes and drawing rooms, intellectuals dreamed of a universal brotherhood, yet their governments stockpiled rifles by the millions. Modernity had replaced superstition, but not folly. The same factories that printed newspapers of optimism could, with a day's order, forge artillery. The continent that had taught the world reason was preparing for madness. The spark came from a single pistol. In June 1914, an assassin's bullet in Sarajevo pierced not only an archduke, but an entire age. Within weeks, alliances became obligations, and obligations became war. Soldiers marched to the front beneath banners that promised glory. They found mud, wire, and gas. At the Somme and Verdun, the earth itself seemed to bleed. Machine guns turned courage into statistics, and the sky, once the symbol of transcendence, filled with the drone of aircraft. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, 10 million were dead, and an old world lay buried beside them. What followed was victory without peace. Empires that had ruled for centuries, Austrian, Russian, Ottoman, collapsed into dust, replaced by fragile republics that called themselves free but trembled with fear. Germany, defeated and humiliated, watched inflation turn money into ash. In the streets of Weimar, philosophers spoke of despair, while veterans limped past them, remembering a time when certainty had been simple and cruel. The war had ended, but its poison lingered in the blood of Europe. The 1920s glittered briefly like glass before shattering. Cities rebuilt, jazz played, women voted, and airplanes crossed the Atlantic. But the optimism was brittle, a mask over anxiety. Economic booms turned to crashes. Fortunes vanished overnight. Democracy, young and untested, stumbled beneath the weight of hunger and humiliation. In that vacuum, voices of iron rose to promise order once more. From the ruins of empires, dictatorships emerged like weeds after rain. In Italy, Mussolini marched on Rome, declaring that he would restore the vigor of Caesar. In Germany, a failed artist found in resentment the language of destiny. Adolf Hitler turned defeat into a creed, his rhetoric a hymn to revenge. The swastika, stark and ancient, became the emblem of a nation convinced that purity could be engineered. Propaganda replaced prayer. Obedience became faith. The age that had worshipped progress now worshipped power. Meanwhile, to the east, another experiment in certainty had begun. Lenin's revolution in Russia promised a world without kings or masters, but its utopia was born in civil war. When Stalin inherited the revolution, ideology hardened into terror. Farmers were starved in the name of progress. and millions vanished into camps that stretched across the snow. Two systems now divided the continent, one ruled by race, the other by class, each claiming to perfect humanity through discipline. Between them lay the fragile democracies of the West, struggling to survive the century's extremes. By the late 1930s, Europe was once again armed and waiting for disaster. Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland, swallowed Austria, and carved Czechoslovakia into pieces while diplomats spoke of peace in our time. Appeasement was not cowardice, but fatigue. No one wished to believe that history could relapse into horror. But on September 1st, 1939, German tanks crossed into Poland, and the illusion dissolved. War returned with a vengeance. This time it moved faster, fought by machines that rendered distance meaningless. In weeks, France collapsed. In months, Europe bowed beneath the swastika. London burned under nightly bombardment. Warsaw starved behind walls. Athens and Amsterdam fell silent. Across occupied lands, resistance flickered, small, fierce, and often doomed. The old virtues of courage and sacrifice survived, but they fought against a cruelty that seemed infinite. In the East, the conflict became apocalypse. Nazi ideology turned conquest into extermination, defining whole peoples as enemies to existence itself. Ghettos became prisons, and prisons became killing grounds. Trains rolled endlessly toward camps with names that would outlive the language that built them: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. The Holocaust was not a relapse into barbarism, but the perfection of modernity's logic, efficiency without conscience. By 1941, the flames had crossed oceans. The German invasion of the Soviet Union opened a front of annihilation. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor drew America into the war. What had begun in Europe became the world's tragedy. From Stalingrad's ruins to the beaches of Normandy, the conflict reversed its tide through courage, numbers, and attrition. Cities fell one by one, until Berlin itself lay encircled in 1945, a shell of ash and rubble. Hitler's suicide ended a nightmare, but not the reckoning. When the smoke cleared, Europe was unrecognizable. Tens of millions were dead. Borders had shifted. Faith in civilization itself was broken. The victors stood among ruins that looked identical to defeat. From the east, the Red Army occupied half the continent. From the west, American bombers surveyed cities leveled by progress. Between them lay the heart of Europe, divided yet dependent on both. In the ashes of total war, a new world order was forming, one built on fear of the very power humanity had proven capable of wielding. The atomic age had dawned. Science, which once promised enlightenment, now held the means to erase the species that created it. In 1945, Europe's dominance of the world ended, but its story did not. The continent had turned its genius against itself, and survived only to question what survival meant. Out of the ruins of empire and ideology, the question remained: could a civilization that had built Auschwitz and Hiroshima ever trust its own reason again? The war ended, but peace arrived without celebration. Europe was a graveyard lit by victory flares, its cities hollowed, its people wandering roads that no longer led home. In the east, Soviet tanks rolled through Warsaw, Prague, and Berlin. In the west, American convoys brought food and authority. Liberation blurred into occupation. The continent that had once ruled the world now waited to be divided by it. At Yalta and Potsdam, the victors drew new lines across the map. Lines meant to preserve peace, but destined to define a new conflict. The Iron Curtain fell not with a crash, but a whisper of barbed wire, cutting Europe in half from the Baltic to the Adriatic. Behind it, Moscow rebuilt its empire in ideology. binding nations to communism with treaties signed under the watch of soldiers. To the west, Washington answered with aid and alliance. The Marshall Plan's dollars rebuilding the ruins, NATO's shield promising protection through unity. Between them lay Germany, split into two hearts beating out of rhythm. Out of the rubble rose unlikely strength. In Paris and Rome, in Brussels and Bonn, leaders who had survived dictatorship sought to prevent its return by binding their nations together. The European coal and steel community of 1951, so modest a phrase for so radical a dream, turned the engines of war into instruments of peace. French ore and German coal, once tools of destruction, now built prosperity side by side. The experiment grew into a union of markets, then of laws, and finally, tentatively, of identity. Europe, fractured for 1,000 years, began to imagine itself as one. Still, the memory of division was never far. In the East, Stalin's successors tightened their grip through fear and bureaucracy. Prague was silenced, Budapest crushed, Berlin walled off by concrete and command. The West responded with television, jazz, and consumer comfort, a subtler conquest fought through desire rather than doctrine. The Cold War was not only a contest of armies, but of imaginations, a struggle to prove whose idea of freedom could fill an empty life more convincingly. Nuclear weapons gave that rivalry its edge and its restraint. The bomb turned annihilation into policy, its presence both threat and guarantee. For 40 years, Europe lived beneath a peace maintained by terror, a balance of power that could collapse with a single miscalculation. Yet even as governments prepared for extinction, ordinary life resumed. Children played under mushroom cloud posters. Students filled new universities. The arts rediscovered irony where once there had been awe. Survival had become the continent's quietest triumph. The 1960s brought another revolution, this one without barricades. Young people raised on peace, and plenty demanded more than security. They wanted meaning. Paris flared again in protest, but this time the students faced not kings, but their own parents' indifference. Across the West, voices called for equality of race, gender, and expression, for liberation not of nations, but of selves. In the East, dissidents smuggled typewritten poems past censors, whispering that truth still mattered. A century earlier, Europe had rebelled against monarchs. Now it rebelled against conformity itself. Through it all, the Soviet bloc endured, brittle yet immense, until its foundations finally cracked. The late 1980s saw revolutions without bloodshed. Flags raised, walls breached, statues toppled to applause, rather than gunfire. The Berlin Wall fell like a sigh the world had been holding for half a century. Within 2 years, the empire that had replaced the Tsars vanished into history, and the nations of Eastern Europe stepped blinking into freedom. Democracy, long exiled, returned home. The European Union grew from that euphoria, expanding eastward, promising that history's circle could finally close. Borders softened, currencies merged, old enemies shared a parliament instead of a battlefield. Yet unity proved as fragile as division. Prosperity drew in migrants from war-torn lands beyond the continent's edge. Economic crises tested solidarity. Nationalism, long thought buried, stirred again beneath the banners of integration. The question that had haunted Europe for centuries, what holds us together, remained unanswered, only reformulated. Meanwhile, the world that Europe had once ruled was changing faster than it could comprehend. Colonial empires dissolved into independent states whose scars still bled. Global power shifted toward America, and, later, to rising giants in Asia. The continent's influence endured in law, art, and technology, but its dominance was gone. For the first time since the Crusades, Europe had to learn how to lead without conquering. Its greatest achievement was no longer empire, but restraint. Memory became its moral compass. Museums and memorials rose where camps and killing fields had stood. The past was taught not as triumph, but as warning. In the ruins of Warsaw and the valleys of Verdun, silence became a kind of prayer, a vow that civilization must remember its own fragility. The continent that had perfected destruction now perfected reflection. And yet, even reflection cannot still the currents of time. The 21st century brought new uncertainties. Digital revolutions that blurred truth, migrations that tested compassion, pandemics and wars that reminded Europe how narrow its borders truly were. Beneath its institutions and treaties, the old restlessness persisted, the tension between unity and individuality, between reason and belief, between peace hard-won and peace taken for granted. What began as survival after 1945 had become experiment. Could a continent that had destroyed itself learn to share its destiny? The answer remained unfinished. Each generation redrew the line between memory and ambition, between the ghosts of the past and the shape of the future. Europe, weary and wise, still searched for the balance that had eluded it since the first stones of civilization were raised. From the icebound hunters of its prehistory to the architects of its modern unity, the story of Europe remained one long negotiation between ruin and renewal. The wars had taught it endurance, the revolutions defiance, the faith's humility. And though its empires had crumbled, its music, languages, and ideas still circled the world. In that endurance lay its truest identity, a civilization that never ceased to begin again.